September 2, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signs the Instrument of Surrender. World War II is over. Surrounding the Missouri are dozens of Allied warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Lots of aircraft carriers. The United States alone has 99 carriers in service. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers. The largest naval air force ever assembled. Britain has 52, Canada has 2, Australia has 2. Over 150 Allied aircraft carriers, representing billions of dollars, millions of man-hours, the cutting edge of naval technology. They won the war, dominated the Pacific, hunted U-boats in the Atlantic, supported amphibious invasions across the globe. But now the war is over, and suddenly the world's navies have a massive problem. What do you do with 150 aircraft carriers when there's no one left to fight? Do you scrap them, store them, sell them, convert them to civilian use? The answer, all of the above, and some options no one expected. This is the story of what happened to Allied aircraft carriers after World War II, how some fought in new wars, how others became training ships for former enemies, how one became a carnival attraction, how several were deliberately destroyed in atomic bomb tests, and how a few are still floating today, 80 years later. Let's start with the numbers. When World War II ends in September 1945, the United States Navy has an overwhelming force of aircraft carriers, 23 Essex-class fleet carriers, large, modern, capable ships designed for extended Pacific operations, 9 Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, fast but smaller, and 67 escort carriers, small, slow carriers built on merchant ship hulls, designed for convoy protection and amphibious support. That's 99 carriers total. For comparison, every other navy in the world combined has maybe 60. The Royal Navy has 52 carriers of various types. Fleet carriers like HMS, Illustrious, and HMS, Indomitable. Light fleet carriers. Escort carriers borrowed from American production. Canada operates 2 escort carriers, HMS, Nabob, and HMS, Puncher, both on loan from Britain. Australia has 2, HMS Terrible, not yet commissioned, and eventually HMAS Sydney. France will soon receive several carriers through American aid programs. The math is brutal. In September 1945, there are approximately 155 Allied aircraft carriers in service or under construction. By 1948, the military budget has been slashed. The war is over. Millions of servicemen are being demobilized. Congress and Parliament want the money spent elsewhere. The navies face an immediate crisis. Maintaining 155 carriers is impossible, unnecessary, ruinously expensive. Decisions have to be made, fast. The American assessment begins in late 1945. The Navy creates a classification system. Which carriers are worth keeping? Which should be retired immediately? The criteria: age, condition, combat record, technological sophistication, operating costs. The escort carriers go first. These ships, built quickly on merchant hulls, were never intended for long service. They're slow, lightly armed, limited capacity. Perfect for convoy escort during a submarine war, useless for the peacetime Navy. Between September 1945 and March 1946, all 67 escort carriers are decommissioned. Some go directly to scrap yards, cut apart, melted down. Others are sold to civilian operators, converted to merchant ships, freighters, tankers. A few are retained in reserve, mothballed at naval facilities, just in case. The USS Casablanca, the lead ship of her class, is scrapped in 1947. The USS Guadalcanal, famous for capturing the German submarine U-505, is decommissioned in 1946. She sits in reserve until 1958, then is scrapped. 67 escort carriers, gone in less than a year. The light carriers face similar fates. The 9 Independence-class ships are evaluated individually. Most are decommissioned by 1947. The USS Independence herself becomes a target ship. Used for weapons testing, eventually sunk as a radioactive hulk in 1951. The USS Princeton, the second ship to bear that name after the original was sunk at Leyte Gulf, is decommissioned in 1949, scrapped in 1973. Several Independence-class carriers are retained as training ships, used to train new aviators, then decommissioned in the early 1950s. By 1950, only 2 Independence-class carriers remain in active service. The Essex-class fleet carriers receive the most attention. These are the Navy's crown jewels, modern, capable, representing the best carrier design of World War II. But even here, cuts are necessary. Several Essex-class carriers are decommissioned immediately, placed in reserve. The Navy keeps them maintained, ready for reactivation if needed. Others continue operating. Reduced peacetime schedules, smaller air wings, but still operational. The USS Midway, commissioned in September 1945, just after the war ended, represents the next generation. Larger, more capable. Designed to operate heavier aircraft. 3 Midway-class carriers are completed. USS Midway, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, and USS Coral Sea. They become the backbone of the post-war carrier fleet, but maintaining even this reduced force is expensive. By 1950, the U.S. Navy operates only about 15 active carriers, from 99 to 15 in less than 5 years. The rest sit in mothballs, waiting. The Royal Navy faces even more dramatic cuts. Britain is bankrupt. The war cost billions of pounds. The empire is collapsing. India gains independence in 1947. Other colonies follow. The Royal Navy can't afford 52 carriers. The assessment is swift and brutal. The escort carriers, most on loan from America, are returned to the U.S. Navy, which promptly scraps most of them. The older fleet carriers are evaluated for retention. Ships like HMS Illustrious, HMS Formidable, and HMS Victorious. Illustrious, veteran of Taranto, Malta, and the Pacific, is decommissioned in 1954, scrapped in 1956. Formidable serves until 1953, then scrapped. Victorious receives a massive reconstruction, essentially rebuilt, serves until 1968. Britain keeps approximately 10 carriers in active service through the late 1940s, down from 52. But there's a twist. Britain begins selling carriers to other nations. Australia purchases HMAS Sydney in 1948. She serves until 1973. Canada buys HMCS Magnificent in 1948. Operates her until 1957. The Netherlands receives Carol Dorman, formerly HMS Venerable, in 1948. France receives several carriers through American military aid, including the Arromanches, formerly HMS Colossus. India purchases HMS Hercules, renamed INS Vikrant, in 1957. Argentina buys ARA Independencia, formerly HMS Warrior, in 1958. Brazil acquires Minas Gerais, formerly HMS Vengeance, in 1960. These transfers keep several British carriers in service for decades, under different flags, fighting different wars. Some see combat in conflicts Britain never imagined, but we're getting ahead of ourselves, because in June 1950, everything changes. June 25, 1950. North Korea invades South Korea. The United States responds immediately. The United Nations authorizes military action. Suddenly, the mothballed carriers are needed again. The USS Valley Forge, an Essex-class carrier decommissioned in 1949, is hastily reactivated, July 3, 1950. Just 8 days after the war begins, Valley Forge launches the first carrier airstrikes of the Korean War. Her aircraft hit targets near Pyongyang. The carrier is back in combat barely a year after being mothballed. More carriers follow: the USS Philippine Sea, USS Boxer, USS Leyte, USS Princeton, a new Essex-class ship, not the sunken one. Britain sends HMS Triumph. She arrives in July 1950. Her aircraft support UN ground forces throughout the war. Australia's HMAS. Sydney serves in Korean waters, provides air support and anti-submarine patrols. By late 1950, there are typically 4 to 5 carriers operating in Korean waters at any given time: American, British, Australian. They provide close air support, interdiction strikes, combat air patrols, search and rescue. The missions are different from World War II. No massive carrier versus carrier battles. No Pearl Harbors or Midways. Instead, daily strikes against bridges, railways, supply depots, troop concentrations. It's grueling work, dangerous. The North Koreans and Chinese have extensive anti-aircraft defenses, and in November 1950, something new appears: MiG-15 jet fighters. The carriers are still operating propeller-driven aircraft: F-4U Corsairs, A-D Sky Raiders, F-9 F Panthers, early jets, but not as advanced as the MiG-15. The war proves several things to the Navy. First, carriers are still essential, even in a limited war. Second, carrier aircraft need to evolve. Jets, faster jets, better jets. Third, the Essex-class carriers, designed in the early 1940s, need modernization to operate these new jets. The Korean War saves the carrier fleet, proves their continued relevance, justifies maintaining more carriers in active service. But it also exposes their limitations. These are World War II ships trying to operate in the jet age. Something has to change. While carriers are fighting in Korea, the U.S. Navy begins an ambitious modernization program, the SCB-27 program, and later the SCB-125 program. SCB stands for Ship Characteristics Board, the Navy committee that approves design changes. The goal: upgrade Essex-class carriers to operate jet aircraft. The modifications are extensive: stronger flight decks, reinforced arresting gear, improved catapults, new elevators, steam catapults to launch heavier jets, angled flight decks for safer landings, mirror landing systems, improved radar. Essentially, the Navy is rebuilding these carriers from the inside out. The USS Oriskany becomes the prototype. Commissioned in 1950, she receives all the modifications immediately. Other Essex-class carriers follow. One by one, they enter shipyards for 2 to 3 year rebuilds: the USS Hancock, USS Ticonderoga, USS Lexington, USS Shangri-La, USS Essex herself. The cost per ship, $40 to $80 million, more than it cost to build them originally. But it's cheaper than building new carriers, and faster. By the late 1950s, the Navy has approximately 15 modernized Essex-class carriers capable of operating jets. They'll serve for another 30 to 40 years, some into the 1990s. The Midway class receives similar upgrades. Though they're larger and more capable, they still need modernization for jets. USS Midway serves until 1992, 47 years of service. But not all carriers get modernized. Some are simply too old, too damaged, too expensive to rebuild, and a few face a very different fate. July 1946, Bikini Atoll, the Marshall Islands. The U.S. military is preparing to test atomic bombs. Operation Crossroads. The goal? Understand what nuclear weapons do to ships, how they affect naval operations, whether the Navy has a future in the atomic age. The military assembles a target fleet. Over 90 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers. The USS Saratoga, one of the Navy's first carriers, commissioned in 1927, is selected as a target. She's too old for modernization, too small for jets, but she's legendary. A veteran of numerous Pacific battles, she's moored near Ground Zero at Bikini, July 1st, 1946. Test able. An atomic bomb dropped from a B-29. The bomb misses the aim point slightly. Saratoga survives the blast. Heavily damaged, but still afloat. July 25th, 1946. Test Baker. An atomic bomb detonated underwater. The underwater blast is far more destructive. A massive column of radioactive water rises 6,000 feet. The shockwave is tremendous. Saratoga is directly in the blast zone. The ship is lifted, twisted, flooded. She sinks 7.5 hours later. the first carrier ever sunk by an atomic bomb. Also sunk, USS Independence, the light carrier. She survives the blasts but is too radioactive to salvage. Scuttled in 1951, the tests prove that carriers are vulnerable to nuclear weapons. But they also prove they're more resilient than expected. Ships farther from the blasts survive. The Navy concludes carriers still have a role, even in atomic warfare. They just need to avoid being at ground zero. Saratoga's loss is symbolic, the old giving way to the new, the propeller age ending, the jet age beginning. But some old carriers escape scrapping through sheer luck, or tourism. The USS Shangri-La CV-38 serves until 1971, then decommissioned. She sits in reserve until 1988, then scrapped. But the USS Intrepid CV-11 gets a different fate. Commissioned in 1943, she fought across the Pacific. Kamikaze hits, typhoon damage. She survived everything. Decommissioned in 1974 after 31 years of service, including Vietnam. Instead of scrapping, she becomes a museum. The Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum in New York City. Today you can walk her decks, see the hangar bay, stand on the flight deck where jets once launched. The USS Midway becomes a museum in San Diego. Commissioned 1945, decommissioned 1992. Opened as a museum in 2004. The USS Hornet CV-12 becomes a museum in Alameda, California. The USS Yorktown CV-10 becomes a museum in Charleston, South Carolina. The USS Lexington CV-16 becomes a museum in Corpus Christi, Texas. 5 Essex-class carriers preserved as museums. 5 out of 23, the lucky ones. The rest were scrapped, their metal recycled, their names reassigned to new ships. But the museum ships keep the memory alive, allow new generations to see what these vessels were like, to understand the scale, the complexity, the history. Meanwhile, Britain's carriers face their own evolution. By the 1960s, Britain is withdrawing from empire, closing overseas bases, reducing military commitments. The carrier fleet shrinks steadily, from 10 active carriers in 1950 to 5 by 1960 to 2 by 1970. HMS Ark Royal, the 4th ship to bear that name, serves until 1978, the last conventional British carrier. After she's decommissioned, Britain has no fixed-wing carrier capability for decades. The Royal Navy shifts to smaller carriers operating helicopters and later V/STOL aircraft like the Harrier. The massive fleet carriers are gone, scrapped, sold, converted. Some British carriers serve under other flags for years after Britain releases them. India's INS Vikrant, ex-HMS Hercules, serves from 1961 to 1997, 36 years under the Indian flag. She fights in the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War. Her aircraft support the liberation of Bangladesh. A British carrier, built in 1945, fighting a war in 1971, under an Indian flag, in South Asian waters. Argentina's ARA Independencia serves until 1970. Brazil's Minas Gerais serves until 2001, 56 years after being built. These carriers have second, third, even fourth lives, far from their original purposes. And then there are the strange fates. The USS Oriskany CV-34 serves until 1976, then mothballed. In 2006, she's deliberately sunk off the coast of Florida, turned into an artificial reef. She sits 212 feet down. The largest vessel ever intentionally sunk as a reef. Divers explore her now, swim through the hangar bay, see the flight deck covered in coral, the USS Saratoga CV-60. Not the original, a later Forrestal-class carrier, is scrapped in 2023 for 1 penny. The scrap dealer pays 1 cent for a 60,000-ton aircraft carrier. Such is the value of obsolete warships. The USS Enterprise CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered carrier, is being slowly dismantled. Decommissioned in 2017 after 55 years of service. Her 8 nuclear reactors must be carefully removed, a process taking years. Eventually, she'll be completely scrapped. only her name living on in the next enterprise being built. But let's return to the question of combat. Korean war carriers prove the concept still works. But what about the next war, Vietnam? Between 1964 and 1975, U.S. carriers operate continuously off the coast of Vietnam, the Yankee Station and Dixie Station, locations in the South China Sea where carriers patrol. Essex-class carriers, Midway-class carriers, New Forrestal-class carriers, Kitty Hawk-class carriers. They launch thousands of sorties, strike missions into North Vietnam, close air support in South Vietnam, reconnaissance, search and rescue. Several World War II-era carriers serve in Vietnam. USS Bon Homme, Richard, CV-31. Commissioned 1944, served 6 tours in Vietnam. USS Hancock, CV-19. Commissioned 1944, 5 Vietnam deployments. USS Oriskany, CV-34. Commissioned 1950. Multiple Vietnam tours. These ships, designed to fight Japan in 1945, are now fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia, launching jets that didn't exist when they were built. The carriers perform well, but they're clearly reaching the end of their useful lives. By the 1970s, the last Essex-class carriers are being retired. The future belongs to the super carriers. Forrestal class, Kitty Hawk class, Enterprise class, Nimitz class, ships of 80,000 plus tons, nuclear-powered, capable of operating 90-plus aircraft. The World War II carriers can't compete, can't be modified any further, can't accommodate the newest aircraft. One by one, they're decommissioned. The last Essex-class carrier in service is USS Lexington, CV-16, serving as a training carrier until 1991. 46 years of service, longer than any other Essex-class ship. When she's decommissioned, it marks the end of an era. The last World War II fleet carrier leaves active service, almost exactly 46 years after VJ Day. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union has been watching, learning, building. The Soviets captured no carriers during World War II, had no experience operating them, but they saw what American carriers did. In Korea, in Vietnam, during peacetime, they began building their own, starting in the 1970s, the Kiev class, the Kuznetsov class. By the 1980s, the Soviets have carriers, not as capable as American ones, but carriers nonetheless. The cycle continues. Innovations from one war influence the next. Designs evolve, technology advances. But it all traces back to those World War II carriers, the Essex class, the Midway class, the British illustrious class. They wrote the playbook. Everyone else followed. Today, in 2024, approximately a dozen nations operate aircraft carriers. THAAD United States 11 supercarriers, all nuclear-powered, all descended from the designs proven in World War II. China, 3 carriers, including one purchased from Ukraine, the Liaoning, originally a Soviet carrier. United Kingdom, 2 Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, the largest British carriers ever built. France, 1 nuclear carrier, the Charles de Gaulle. India, 2 carriers. Italy, 2 carriers. Japan, 2 helicopter destroyers that look suspiciously like carriers. Russia, 1 carrier, often broken. Spain, 1 carrier. Thailand, 1 small carrier, rarely operational. Brazil, currently none, but operated carriers until recently. Every single one of these carriers traces its lineage back to World War II. The angled flight deck, British innovation, 1952. Steam catapults, British invention, American perfection, 1950s. Mirror landing systems, British design, 1950s. Armored flight decks, British concept, World War II. Nuclear propulsion, American innovation, 1961. All developments from the post-war period, all building on World War II experience. And the museum ships keep that connection alive. USS Intrepid in New York, over 1 million visitors per year. USS Midway in San Diego, one of the most visited museums in California. USS Yorktown in Charleston, hosts overnight camping for Boy Scout troops. USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, popular school field trip destination. USS Hornet in Alameda. Claims to be haunted, ghost tours, 5 survivors out of 99 American carriers. Britain has no carrier museums. All were scrapped or sold. But HMS Belfast, a cruiser, serves as a museum in London, representing the Royal Navy's history. So what happened to the Allied aircraft carriers after World War II? Most were scrapped, quickly, efficiently, ruthlessly. Some were sold, to allies, to friends, to anyone who could afford them. Several were deliberately destroyed, in atomic tests, as weapons experiments, as artificial reefs. A few were modernized, rebuilt, kept flying for decades beyond their intended lifespan, and 5 became museums, permanent reminders of what came before. The carriers that survived saw combat in Korea, Vietnam, the Falklands, the Indo-Pakistani War. They served under American, British, Canadian, Australian, French, Dutch, Indian, Argentine, and Brazilian flags. They launched propeller aircraft and jets, operated with wooden decks and angled steel decks, carried everything from corsairs to crusaders. From 1945 to 1991, World War II carriers remained in service somewhere, 46 years of continuous operation. That's longer than the space between World War I and World War II. It's a testament to their design, their adaptability, their fundamental soundness. But it's also a reminder that weapons of war have limited lifespans. Technology moves on, needs change, budgets shift. The 155 Allied carriers of 1945 are gone, replaced by new designs, new capabilities, new missions. But their legacy remains. In the carriers sailing today, in the museums preserving their memory, in the lessons learned from their service. The Essex class taught the Navy how to fight carrier wars. The Midway class showed how to operate in the jet age. The British carriers demonstrated the value of armored decks and angled landing areas. All lessons still relevant, still applied, still shaping naval aviation 80 years later. That's what happened to the Allied aircraft carriers after World War II. They fought, they evolved, they taught, they served, and a very few still float. Reminders of the fleet that won the Pacific, changed naval warfare forever, and refused to become obsolete.